Welcome to Ream Library. It's good to see a nice crowd out this afternoon. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. And throughout the year, the McFarland Center sponsors and supports programs that explore basic human questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. This lecture today, like many of our most significant lectures, is sponsored under the aegis of the Deitchman Family Lectures on Religion and Modernity, and I'm grateful to the Deitchman family for making it possible. Today's talk considers the links between morality and empathy and the degree to which empathy is an effective way to meet our mutual obligations, a foundation for morality. We've already fielded a few comments from folks who are puzzled on why we would sponsor a talk against empathy, and I'm sure that our guest speaker, Paul Bloom, will clear that up in a few minutes. He says he's going to be provocative. Paul Bloom is the Brooks and Suzanne Ragen Professor of Psychology and chair of the Cognitive Science Program at Yale University. His research explores how children and adults understand the physical and social world, with special focus on morality, religion, fiction, and art. His argument today draws upon his research in psychopathy, criminal behavior, charitable giving, infant cognition, cognitive neuroscience, and Buddhist meditation practices. He's past president of the Society for Philosophy and Psychology and co-editor of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, one of the major journals in the field. He's written for scientific journals such as Nature and Science, and for popular outlets such as the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly. That's not too popular now, but we'll call that popular, good. He's the author of, or editor of 6 books, including one, Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil, and another, How Pleasure Works, The New Science of Why We Like What We Like. Bloom has won numerous awards for his research and teaching, including Templeton Foundation grants, National Science Foundation grants, the Stanton Prize from the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, and the Lex Hickson Prize for Teaching Excellence in the Social Sciences at Yale. So please join me in welcoming Paul Bloom.
Thank you for the very gracious introduction, and actually thank you, Tom, for inviting me, and for all of you for being here. I really appreciate it. So sometimes friends ask me at social events what I'm up to, and you know, to be polite, and then I tell them I'm writing a book, and it's still to be polite. They say, so what's it about? They ask, and I say I'm writing a book on empathy. And I notice that when I say the word, people kind of smile. They think it's a nice topic. And then I say I'm against it. And then there's often kind of a nervous chuckle, and I'll look away. And I've learned that people think that that's nuts. Being against empathy is like being against world peace or being against kittens. But I am against empathy, and I want to convince you, or to at least take seriously the idea, that you should be against empathy too. Now, part of the problem here is terminological, that people mean different things by empathy. So some people, when they talk about empathy, they mean everything good. Concern, compassion, kindness, love, morality. And if that's what you mean by empathy, I'm totally for it. These are all obviously good things. What I want to argue is actually, it's because I think these are good things, I'm going to make the argument that I will. Now, sometimes when people talk about empathy, they refer to what psychologists often call social cognition or social intelligence, theory of mind reading, but also sometimes cognitive empathy. And this is the capacity to judge what others are thinking and feeling, to make sense of what's going on in other people's heads. Now, I have mixed feelings about this. I think that this is really important if you want to be a good person. If you want to be a good person, it's very important to know what other people want and what other people feel. But on the other hand, this, like any other form of intelligence, is amoral, in that a really bad person, a con man, a psychopath, a seducer, also would benefit from these great powers to discern the minds of other people in order to exploit and manipulate them. So that's not what I mean by empathy either. What I mean by empathy is what scholars like Adam Smith, in his wonderful book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, described as sympathy. And here's Smith outlining it. When he says, when we see somebody in some sort of suffering or pain, we place ourselves in his situation and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensation, even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them. And, you know, to put it differently, we put ourselves in other people's shoes. This is what I mean by empathy. Smith gives all sorts of examples. When we see a stroke aimed and just ready to fall upon the leg arm of another person, we naturally shrink and draw back our own leg or our arm. And when it does fall, we feel it in some measure and are hurt by it as well as the sufferer. This is my favorite illustration of an empathic response. There's a huge literature in cognitive neuroscience, affective neuroscience now, looking at the neural foundations of empathy. And one of the cool findings that's been replicated dozens, probably hundreds of times by now, is that there's a sense in which empathy is literal, and that we literally feel what other people are feeling. So for instance, in this study, if you see somebody else in pain, either because they're poked or shocked or burned, parts of your brain will become active. And these are, to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent, the very same parts that would be active if you yourself were shocked or poked or burned. So there's a sense we literally feel one another's pain. There's a lot of enthusiasm for mirror neuron theories of empathy, and I'm actually quite critical of them for reasons I'm happy to discuss. But it does seem clear that empathy might be a specific instantiation of a more general propensity we have to mimic other people, to mirror them. And we behaviorally mirror other people. Here's my favorite example. This guy at the soccer game, and the guy misses a big kick, and he puts his hands on the side of his head in anguish, and that's not very interesting. But look at the people around him. And I'm a developmental psychologist, and one of the things we know is that empathy emerges early. So even young children, when they see someone else in pain, will express the pain themselves. It will hurt them as if they themselves were experiencing it. A lot of psychologists and philosophers are interested in empathy. Dan Batson has done more work than anybody else exploring what he calls the empathy-altruism hypothesis, which is that if you feel empathy for somebody, it makes you more willing to help them. Martin Hoffman has argued that empathy is the source of morality in children. It's the sort of origin of more subtle morality. Franz de Waal argues that, even takes it broader to talk about primates, arguing that we don't live in an age of reason, but rather an age of empathy. Simon Baron-Cohen, I think, makes the most extreme claim, arguing that evil basically is to be deficient in empathy. All evil equates to, for Baron-Cohen, empathy erosion. It's nothing more and nothing less. But it's not just psychologists, public figures, prominent public figures, also applaud empathy. More than any other president, Obama has sung the praises of empathy. He says, for instance, when you choose to broaden your ambit of concern and empathize with the plight of others, whether they are close friends or distant strangers, it becomes harder not to act, harder not to help. The biggest deficit we have in our society and the world right now is an empathy deficit. If you look on Amazon for books with empathy in the title, you find over 1,000. These include sort of self-help books. They include books for children, to give to children, or for parents raising children. They include marketing books, like Well Designed, How to Sell Your Products Through Empathy, and an occasional science book, like Mirroring People. The use of empathy has gone up steadily in literature since the term was coined in 1909, and has gone up steadily in Google searches over time. So, what's not to like? Well, one thing to realize is, even if you're the biggest fan of empathy, you should acknowledge that there are other ways to come to moral judgments and moral action. So this is a classic example in moral philosophy. First thought of, I think, by the Chinese philosopher Mencius, but then used by contemporary Western philosophers like Peter Unger and Peter Singer, which is, you're walking down the road and you see a child drowning. And it's easy for you to just kind of go in the water and pull the child out and save her. And people say, philosophy is different. Everybody says, that's a good thing. Everyone would acknowledge that's a good thing. And I imagine if you were in this situation, you would do this. But now, you could do this through empathy in the literal sense. You could see her drowning and feel what it's like to be drowning. Experience drowning yourself. And that could catalyze your behavior. Or you could imagine her parents, hypothetically, hearing that she died. Sense their anguish, feel that anguish yourself. You could do all of that. This is ridiculous. Nobody would do that. You'd see her drown, you'd say, what, that's really a bad thing for a kid to drown, and you'd wait in and pull her out. And more generally, the philosopher Jesse Prince points out, there's all sorts of cases where we recognize something as wrong, but there's no empathy can't be involved in it, in part because there's no specific victim to focus on. So for instance, he talks about harmless wrongs. So people have certain sex acts that they might believe are morally wrong. peeping at somebody from a distance, or molesting somebody they don't know, and even if they don't know it, a sleeping child or something, that we say is wrong, even if we can't pick out a victim. More generally, there's a lot of things that we recognize as wrong that have diffuse effects that you can't really point to one person to empathize with. Most of us would view it wrong to throw our garbage out of our car window, or cheat on our taxes, or shoplift from a large store, or if you're a scientist, fake your data, or lie on a grant proposal. Even though you can't point to a single person to empathize with, you still know this is wrong. And this just goes to show that morality and empathy have different scopes. Something could be immoral without triggering empathic concern. You could even pit empathy against morality in a certain way. So I said before, Dan Batson is this huge champion of empathy as a moral force, but he's also very sophisticated about its limits. He developed this lovely study. So he tells people in a study about Sherry Summers. And Sherry Summers is a hypothetical girl, he's described in detail, who is going to die. She has a disease and she's in a lot of pain and she's going to die. And there's nothing much you could do for her. But there's a treatment that will alleviate her pain, make her years be far more enjoyable. And she's on a list, and it's a fair list. You know, people get on the list because of severity and all sorts of things, and she's low on the list. And the question that you face as a subject is, would you move her up the list? And you're told, if you move her up the list, another child who's been deemed to be more deserving won't get the treatment. Now, if you just ask people like that, people tend, the vast majority say, no, it's really sad, but you know, if it's a fair list, why should I penalize some other kid for her? That seems wrong. The other group of people are told exactly the same thing, but Batson just adds one sentence. He says, put yourself in her shoes and feel what she's feeling. That single sentence flips things. And now a majority of people are willing to move her up the list, even though they know it caused another child to drop down. In a way, Batson, you know, your mileage may vary, you might think about this in different ways, but Batson says this is a case where your empathy motivates you to do a decision that upon reflection isn't the right one. Now, the fans of empathy will tell you that it's like a spotlight. And they may say, look, empathy may have its limitations, it may not, but its force comes out as a spotlight, in that you initially may not care about somebody or a situation, but empathy can zoom you in and can make things matter. And the idea that we care, that we're motivated to help individuals that we feel for, as opposed to sort of statistical abstractions, is well known. So Stalin apocryphally said, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Mother Teresa, in an interview, said, if I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will. And there's clever experiments looking at this. So this is work by Deborah Small and George Lowenstein. And what they do is they collect donations for Habitat for Humanity. And in fact, they really do. The money that the subjects give really does go to Habitat for Humanity. And it's actually a real subtle manipulation. They say, your money's going to go to a family to help them build a house. So. Half of the subjects are told the family has been chosen. The other half are told the family will be chosen. You might think, what's the difference? There's a 60% difference in donations. And the way they explain this is, when you say has been chosen, you can envision a specific family. Now, they now exist. Will be chosen, they're an abstraction, and you give less. They did another study where they asked for donations to save the children, and they gave people statistical information about the crisis. And this was the average donation, a little bit over $1 per person. Another group got none of the information, but they were told about a girl. And they heard a name, and they heard a picture. And they saw a picture and got her age, and now the donations jumped up. So you have the spotlight effect of empathy, where it zooms you in. When you feel empathy, it zooms you in to focus on them. And there's abundant evidence from Batson and others, like the Sherry Summers experiment, that if I put myself in your shoes, you'll matter to me more than other people. So, but the problem is spotlights have certain problems. So spotlights have narrow focus, and we often point them in the wrong places. And what I want to suggest is, because of the spotlight properties of empathy, it's biased, enumerate, concrete, and myopic. So To get to that, I want to give some examples of the sort of things over the last 30 or so years that Americans have been very concerned about, that have really hit the news. And one of them is baby Jessica. And many people here are too young for this, but older people remember it. Baby Jessica was a girl who got stuck in a well, and there was a huge rescue operation. And during that period, America was transfixed by her concern. More recently, there was Natalie Holloway, who was a girl lost, perhaps abducted and killed while traveling, and it caused an enormous amount of concern. The psychologist Paul Slovik calculated that when Natalie Holloway was lost, she got more network attention. She got 18 times more network attention than the current famine in the Sudan, which was killing tens of thousands of people. And then more recently, and this speaks to people who live in Connecticut as I do, there was the tragedy in Newtown, where many children were murdered by Adam Lanza in an elementary school. And these are all of these cases, the girl in the well, Natalie Holloway, certainly the children of Sandy Hook, are real serious cases. But psychologists wonder, why them? And it's plain it's not the objective importance. So we are obsessed with mass shootings. But from 1980 to the present, there's been about 60 mass shootings, about 500 dead. I'd have to update my slides. It's now more like 520 dead. You look at this as a proportion of American homicides, it's 0.1%. What this means is that if you could snap your fingers and make it that there will never be a mass shooting again in the United States, later on, looking at crime statistics, no one will know that you did that. It correlates to random variation. It would make literally no difference to the numbers. Yet that's not how it feels psychologically. And the reason why was nicely elaborated by the economist Thomas Schelling many years ago as part of what he called identifiable victim effect. So Schelling writes, "Let a 6-year-old girl with brown hair need thousands of dollars for an operation that will prolong her life until Christmas, and the post office will be swamped with nickels and dimes to save her. But let it be reported that without a sales tax, the hospital facilities of Massachusetts will decline and cause a barely perceptible increase in preventable deaths. Not many will drop a chair and reach for their checkbooks." Statistical deaths don't trigger our empathy, and they don't move us, while the deaths and suffering of particular individuals do. Then there's bias. This was a journalist's rendition of the Ebola crisis. And it was done to represent the fact that, sorry, this was a cartoonist depiction of the Ebola crisis, to represent the fact that journalists devoted an extraordinary amount of attention to the relatively few white victims of Ebola, while ignoring the far greater suffering among black victims. In fact, again, there was much more attention and money given to the Ebola dog, a dog that was sick and brought to Texas, than there were many of the actual real victims of Ebola. And the race effects in empathy and in concern and compassion are no secret, they're very strong. The work of Jennifer Eberhardt, for instance, finds that holding everything else equal, and you've done statistical analyses and experimental tests, you are far more likely to be executed. Have a jury decide to execute you, or a judge decide to execute you, if you look at the man on the right than the man on the left. Because there's a power, even if you're black, the degree in which you're black correlates to how punitive your punishment is. And again, this is no secret. It is such an extent that The Onion recently satirized it with a headline saying, "Judge rules white girl will be tried as black adult." And so basically the court drawer, artist, was instructed to draw her like that as a part of her punishment. Now, none of these things I'm talking about, the focus on individual unidentifiable victims, the racial bias is special to empathy. But empathy is particularly vulnerable to it, because empathy works by putting yourself in particular people's shoes. It is incredibly manipulated both by the specific focus and also by bias. Annie Dillard, the writer, puts this in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way. She says, "There are 1.2 billion people alive now in China. To get a feeling for what this means, simply take yourself and all your singularity, importance, complexity, and love, and multiply by 1.2 billion. See, nothing to it." And the laboratory studies tell the same story. So yes, if you see somebody poked in the finger, part of your brain that as if you yourself were poked in the finger lights up. But it depends what kind of finger it is. The effect is more powerful if it's the same gender finger and the same color finger. We don't empathize as much with people who look different from us. This is true. For instance, you feel pain. If you see somebody else in pain, you will feel their pain. But that depends critically on who the other person is. In one study in Europe, they had male soccer fans wired up, and they watched someone else in pain. And they were told either that this was somebody supporting their same team or a different team. If it was the same team, when they saw the other person in pain, parts of their own brains associated with pain lit up. When they were told it from a different team, the parts of their brain associated with pain did not light up. Instead, parts of their brain associated with vicarious pleasure became active. Another study by Jean Dussetti, I just heard of it a few days ago, Jean Dussetti in the University of Chicago, showed people videos of people suffering from AIDS. When they were told that these people were suffering from AIDS because they had been given a blood transfusion, there was tremendous empathy, both in self-report and in neural response. When they were told that these people got AIDS through intravenous drug use, all of that went away. So your empathy isn't a sort of natural response. It's highly selective on your own biases and your own preferences. And this sort of thing can matter in the real world. So a hypothetical case. There's a vaccine comes out, and a child gets the vaccine, and because there's something wrong with the vaccine, the child dies. Surely that vaccine program would be shut down. It would be shut down even if there was statistical evidence that the vaccine program saved the lives of a dozen children. Because you could empathize with this girl, the family, the loss. You could really see it, feel it, as you feel the suffering of people in Newtown. But you can't, but the idea statistically of a rise in deaths due to lack of vaccination, who do you empathize with? To take a real case that runs parallel for this, this is Willie Horton. In 1987, then Governor Michael Dukakis he was released as part of a furlough program. And he went on to rape a woman and assault her fiancé. As a result of this, the program was immediately shut down. Dukakis apologized, said it was an embarrassing failure. And he was attacked by it, both by his opponent Al Gore in the primaries and then George Bush afterwards. And Willie Horton became a famous figure, which perhaps ended Dukakis' hopes for presidency. Now, analyses later on showed the furlough program actually saved lives. In that statistically, when a furlough program was operated in the places it was operative, there were fewer murders and rapes and assaults. That meant nothing to people, because you could empathize tremendously with somebody who has been assaulted, but you can't empathize with somebody who would have been assaulted but wasn't because of a program that's in place. There's a huge asymmetry that your empathic engagement sets up. Or take as a broader issue, not a small issue, third world aid. So countries like the United States divert billions of dollars to help in the third world. And often the aid is motivated by certain empathic pleas. Non-governmental organizations, different organizations, make the suffering of certain people salient so as to motivate help. But there is, as I'm sure people know, huge debate over the extent to which this aid is making things better. Where some people say it's making things better, some people say it's not making things better, and there are some cases where the aid is clearly making things worse. And you could imagine how. For instance, it may be very tempting to run in and rescue a bunch of people, but if by rescuing a bunch of people you destroy local institutions that would normally help, you could end up leaving things worse. And there were specific cases of that. Linda Pullman, at one point, asked warlords in Sierra Leone, why did they chop off children's limbs? And this is a horrible thing. Why did they do that? And two of them independently told her the same thing. We do it for you. If there's not a sufficiently gory atrocity, Western nations are uninterested in our country. When NGOs and Western governmental agents come to our country, they pay us to be there. They pay a tax to be there. So all of these programs in Africa that help pay a tax to warlords. We need the money. We had to bring you in. Or take another case, child beggars. So most people, when you see a child beggar in India or Africa, it's often irresistible not to give to them. But there's a virtual consensus that by giving to them, you're making the world worse. You're supporting a criminal organization that kidnaps and often maims, tens of thousands of children. But the empathic force of this, that feeling there's somebody in trouble that you could help, is very powerful. But I think it gives the wrong answer. I want to return to this, but I think I want to return to this, but the answer I don't think is some sort of nihilism or despair, but rather one should try to help other people. But one shouldn't be governed by the emotional feelings that are evoked. One should, as this very nice slogan goes, you should use your head and your heart. Now, a lot of people think when defending empathy, I think a lot of people, particularly liberals, think empathy is on their side in domestic issues that they argue for. A lot of liberals think that liberals are empathic and liberal policies are based on empathy, and conservatives are unempathic and don't draw on empathy. And they would see that, because they're liberal, as an argument for empathy. And in fact, both liberals and conservatives think liberals are more empathic than conservatives. And when you give people empathy tests, liberals are more empathic than conservatives. It's not a huge difference, but it's a reliable one. By far the least empathic are libertarians, who just say, oh, it's not nothing, and so you have people like George Lakoff, who says basically, what progressivism is basically empathy. And if you believe that, you're going to be very much, and you're progressive, you're going to be very much in favor of empathy. But I think that's a poor argument. I think it's a poor argument in a couple of ways. For one thing, if you look at real debates that people have over policy and how empathy is exploited in the course of these debates, it's a bizarre caricature to say the liberals are using empathy and the conservatives aren't. Rather, what you often see is a sort of figure ground perspective, where it's not whether empathy is being used, it's to whom it's being targeted for. If you're in favor of affirmative action, you may try to drive home your case by drawing people's empathy towards a black kid who can't get into college. If you're against affirmative action, you may draw people's empathy towards a white kid who would have gotten to college and couldn't because of a program blocking him. If you're in favor of abortion rights, you might focus very much for empathy for the pregnant mother. While if you are pro-life, you might try to instill empathy for the fetus or embryo. If you're in favor of gun control, whenever something like the Newtown tragedy happens, you'll try to evoke tremendous empathy for the people suffering from gun violence. But if you're against gun control, you would come out, as people do, and talk about empathy for people who are defenseless against criminals because the government has taken away their guns. There's even some cases where there's sort of some paradigmatically empathic causes where empathy isn't on the side at all. And here, so Jeremy Rifkin talks about the environmental crisis in his book, The Empathic Civilization. And he's using empathy in a very broad sense. There's nothing wrong with what he's saying when he says we need more empathy. But if you take empathy in a more small, literal sense, empathy is useless when it comes to global warming and climate change, because there's nobody to empathize with. It's all future individuals. The best you got is something like that, but that's as good as you're going to get. And compare that to opponents, people who oppose making changes to our current economic or tax system due to climate change, will bring out real victims, people whose lives will be messed up if you raise their gas tax, if you make it more expensive to drive a car, and so on. So I've been talking about empathy in the context of public policy. I want to sort of bring it down a little bit and talk about sort of certain intimate relationships. And one intimate relationship is between a doctor and a patient. So many people believe that doctors should be more empathic. And there are many programs that medical schools right now have where they try to train doctors to be more empathic. Maybe surprisingly, I have nothing against this. When you look at what they mean, what they say is they should be nicer, they should listen, they should try to understand, and so on, all good things. But what about the literal sense of empathy in that feeling their patient's pain? Well, there I think there's some really good arguments against it. And this is actually put very elegantly by Leslie Jamison in her wonderful book, The Empathy Exams. So Jamison talks about her work as a model patient. So what she did was she pretended to be a patient as part of medical school students' training. And then she ranked the doctors in training on different abilities, including the empathy scale, which is how empathic they were to her. And as she's doing it, she's really valuing the exercise of empathy by them. But then she gets sick. She gets sick and has to see a series of doctors for real. And then her perspective changes, I think, in an interesting way. And she writes, empathy is always perched precariously between gift and invasion. And she talks about a doctor who was very cruel to her and how negative it was. But then she talked to another doctor who was kind but not empathic. And she said, and she liked it. I didn't need him to be my mother, even for a day. I only needed him to know what he was doing. His calmness didn't make me feel abandoned. It made me feel secure. I need to look at him and see the opposite of my fear, not its echo. And I think this is most extreme in the context of therapy. So therapists should, of course, understand their patients, should care for their patients, and so on. But if I'm with my therapist and I'm all anxious and depressed and I'm saying my life is useless, it's horrible, I don't want her to get anxious and depressed and say, oh, your life's horrible. I want her to care about me and I want her to understand me, but I don't want to infect her with my feelings. I don't want her to absorb my feelings because it would make her less effective. Now, in some way, this all comes under the rubric of a 1970s term, burnout. And there's actually some evidence that people who feel more empathy are more subject to burnout. But the idea here is an old one. And I think it's best expressed in Buddhism, in Buddhist theology. So Buddhist theologians make a distinction between what they call sentimental compassion and great compassion. And sentimental compassion is what I've been calling empathy, which is feeling the suffering of another person. And they recommend against it. It will exhaust you. You will not be able to do it for long. You will be useless to help because you will help for a month and then you will give it up. What they recommend is great compassion, which is at a distance. You feel loving kindness towards people. You want their suffering to go away, but you yourself don't feel their suffering. Now, this is all sort of theoretical abstraction, but these ideas show up in this wonderful research program by the neuroscientist Tanya Singer and a biologist and Buddhist meditator, Matthew Ricard. And what they did was, they've been doing for like a decade now, a series of studies where what they do is they train people to feel empathy, to put themselves in the shoes of other people. And often they do neuroimaging studies when they train people. Then they train other people to feel compassion. And those undergo loving kindness meditations. They're explicitly taught not to feel empathic connection to other people, but to love them, to care for them. And here's how they kind of chop up what they find. Compassion is an other-related emotion, linked up to positive feelings like love, good health, approach, and pro-social motivation. Empathic distress, which arises from an empathic connection, is a self-related emotion. You start worrying about yourself. It leads to negative feelings of stress, poor health and burnout, and withdrawal and non-social behavior. So I'm not arguing that one should be cold-blooded. As we'll see, you need you need to care for other people in order to motivate you to do the numbers, to calculate, to try to make it a better world. But I would push for a distinction between caring for people, compassion, and feeling empathic for them. Finally, let's get even more intimate. When some people think about individuals who lack empathy, they think about psychopaths. And they say, well, you don't want to lack empathy because you'd be like a psychopath. Nobody wants to be a psychopath. It's horrible. And it's true, psychopaths are really bad people. But, and there are some people, like John Ronson in this wonderful book, who argue that the core feature of psychopathy is lack of empathy. The lack of feeling the pain of other people is what drives them to do terrible things or enables them to do terrible things. And I'm going to bookmark this. I'll get back to this at the very end of the talk. But here's what I want to note first. There was a recent study, a meta-analysis, which brought together every study done looking at the relationship between aggression and empathy, looking at physical aggression, verbal aggression, and sexual aggression, testing people with every empathy test on the book. And you could see the results from the title, the non-relation between empathy and aggression, surprising results from a meta-analysis. What was surprising is there was no relationship at all. What this means is, if I want to know for any one of you how likely you are to slap your partner, how likely you are to sexually assault somebody, how likely you are to yell at your child, and I could give you 100 tests, I wouldn't bother giving you an empathy test because there's no predictive power at all. We'll return to that. Okay, now I want to say some nice things about empathy, and then say even worse things about empathy. So empathy, my complaints about empathy has been empathy as in its capacity for moral judgment and for moral action. But there's no doubt that empathy could be a great source of pleasure. So we love putting ourselves in the shoes of fictional characters, one of the great pleasures of fictional of life, I think, of movies and TV shows and so on. Adam Smith points out that there's a certain special pleasure that arises from empathy. He gives this great description. When we've read a book or poem so often we can no longer find any amusement in reading it by ourselves, we can still take pleasure in reading it to a companion. To him it has all the graces of novelty. We enter into the surprise and admiration which it naturally excites in him. That's a very old-timey example, books. But right now what we do is we forward things. We forward lolcats and Facebook shares and so on. I find something funny, a cat trying to use an alarm clock or something. I forward it to you. I laugh. I forward it to you. The pleasure I get imagining your pleasure lights me up. And this is one of the great things about having kids. So one of the great things about having kids is it lets you experience pleasures that you've long experienced for the first time all over again through your child's eyes. Eating ice cream, seeing a Hitchcock movie, whatever. You do it with your kid and you experience it all over again. And this is case in empathy's favor. Michael Sloat points out there's more to this. Michael Sloat makes, and I think this is right, points out that empathy may be related to sort of intimacy in a way. So he gives the example of a father whose daughter collects stamps and says the father could approve of his daughter collecting stamps, could be proud of her, could encourage her. But wouldn't it be better, Sloat said, if he could share her enthusiasm, if he could engage with it? And I think he's right. A final case in favor of empathy is it can be utilized to do good things. The spotlight effect can be directed by people who have certain causes and to motivate people to do good things. So the effect, the identifiable victim effect, is no secret to people who organize charities because they use this all the time to drive us to give. And more generally, there's some arguments that it's been used to affect social change. Martha Nussbaum writes, talking about Greek tragedies, although all of the future citizens who saw ancient tragedies were male, they were asked to have empathy for the suffering of many whose lot could never be theirs, such as Trojans and Persians and Africans, such as wives and daughters and mothers. And it could be that the engagement, the empathic engagement, even with fictional characters, can motivate moral change when done in the right hands. This is Harriet Beecher Stowe. The story goes that in the height of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln invited her to the White House and said to her, "So you're a little lady who started this great big war." And he was talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which few people see as a great work of literature or philosophy or theology. But what it did was it got its readers, mostly white people, to engage empathically with the suffering of slaves and maybe sort of catalyze a moral effect. And here empathy does good. I think more recently, a lot of the changes we've seen in American society in sort of expanding the American moral circle can be explained in terms of the sort of empathic engagement through fiction, not in books, but in television shows, in particular situation comedies. So the Cosby Show, and yes, I have to update my slides, but the Cosby Show, to give it credit, did expand a lot of white American sensibilities and care for Black Americans. Shows like Will and Grace, and more recently Modern Family, have done the same thing for gay men and women. So empathy can be used, your empathic engagement with a character can be used to expand your circle of concern. But it's not quite as simple as that. Because we also have empathic engagement with bad characters. The TV critic Emily Nussbaum describes the phenomenon she calls the bad fan. The bad fan watches Tony Soprano or Walter White, and sees them as heroes, even if you haven't seen the shows, these are people who end up doing terrible things. And Walter White is an interesting case, because for those of you who haven't seen, he started his television show Breaking Bad, and the idea is he starts off as a relatively mild-mannered high school teacher and goes on to become a drug dealer and killer. But what happens is he's so well acted and the story is so well told that one falls into his shoes and takes his side. And this reached a point where his co-star, Anna Gunn played his wife in Breaking Bad. And basically, towards the end of the series, her role was largely relegated to saying, Walt, could you stop killing so many people? And as a result, people hated her. They hated her character, Skylar White, but they also hated the actress, ultimately making death threats against her for playing a moral character who was subverting the goals of the person whose shoes they were falling into. You know, and this is the power of fiction. The power of fiction, empathic engagement in fiction is amoral. This is, Lolita is one of my favorite books. And it's told in the first person, it's beautifully written, and it's a story of this guy who ultimately seeks out to have sex with this young girl, and his progress through this to seduce her and so on. And it is, I would argue, impossible to read it without rooting for him. Impossible to read it without some significant part of you wanting him to succeed. And so the force of fiction is an amoral one. For every Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's a Mein Kampf. For every Schindler's List, there's a Birth of a Nation. Okay, finally, I want to talk a bit about atrocities. So psychologists and political scientists are interested in important issues like why are there atrocities like the Holocaust in Europe and the lynching of African Americans in the American South. And we tend to talk about things like dehumanization and hatred. But one significant force is the force of love, compassion, empathy. Not for these individuals, of course, but for people who are said to be their victims. And this is a point made by Adam Smith again. So Smith writes, when we see one man oppressed or injured by another, the sympathy which we feel to distress the sufferer seems only to serve only to animate our fellow feeling of resentment against the offender. We are rejoiced to see him attack his adversary in his turn and are eager and ready to assist him. And in fact, the lynchings were provoked by stories of African American men attacking white women. The attacks on Jews were provoked by stories of Jewish men preying on innocent children. And using this technique, sparking care for the victim to motivate reprisal is nothing new. It's not just history. When Obama wanted to bomb Syria, there were endless stories of chemical warfare and the victims of Assad. Should we go to war with ISIS, we'll see more and more beheadings and stories like this. And my point is not necessarily a pacifistic one. I think you could talk about the benefits of war, the cost of wars. Some wars may well be moral. But our empathic engagement, suffering, and victims balances things too much on one side of the scale. It strongly motivates us to intervene, while the suffering of the people that might occur as a cost of this intervention is invisible to us. It's airy and statistical. With the graduate student Nick Stagnaro, I've started to do a series of studies exploring this. We did one study where we tested people's empathy, then we told, on standard empathy scale, then we told them about an atrocity in the Middle East where some journalists were kidnapped and tortured. And then we said, what should America do? And we gave a list of actions, from everywhere from nothing to stopping aid to a ground invasion. It turned out that the more empathic they were, that's the scale on top, the stronger a reprisal that they wanted. And we've now replicated this twice over. Okay, so I've argued that empathy is biased, innumerate, concrete, and myopic. It directs our concern for the wrong places. But what's the alternative? And I would think that I want to go back to the slogan of effective altruism, engaging both the heart and the head. Adam Smith, one of the great champions of empathy, asked, why are we nice to strangers? Why do we care about justice? And he said at one point, it's not what you think it is. It's not empathy. It's not the soft power of humanity. It's not that feeble spark of benevolence which nature has lifted up into human heart. It's reason, principle, conscience that calls to us with a voice capable of astonishing the most presumptuous of our passions, that we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. And this is often described as a principle of impartiality. It shows up in religions and different forms of the golden rule, in philosophy and utilitarianism or deontological principles. But my favorite rendition of impartiality is from Humphrey Bogart at the end of Casablanca. So, spoiler alert, he's telling his lover they have to separate, cause 3 people a lot of pain, and he explains why. It doesn't take much to see that the problems of 3 little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. And this is as nice an expression as you could imagine of the need to escape from the particulars that emotions like empathy draw you into towards a more broader moral view. Finally, on this, at one point in this book, Smith asks, what does it take to be a good person? What do you need to be a good person? And he doesn't say you need to be a person of feeling. He lists 2 things. He says you have to be smart, superior reasoning and understanding. Why? Because that enables you to understand the consequences of your action. If you're a dope, you don't know what your actions will cause. And you need to have self-command, what we now call self-control, because that's what keeps you to do the action you know is right, as opposed to go for the temptation of the immediate action. And for that, let's go back to psychopaths. This is a psychopath test. These are items that define a psychopath. And as you can see, there are all sorts of items involving your interpersonal relationships, your emotions, your lifestyle, and your behavior. And psychologists, Jennifer Scheme and a series of other psychologists, have explored at length the question of all of those items, what predicts bad behavior? What makes a psychopath a psychopath? You might think it's callousness and lack of empathy. Plays almost no role. Again, if you had a bunch of psychopaths and you had to figure out, there would be the release from prison, and you had to figure out which ones will come back, and you could give an empathy test, I wouldn't bother. It has no predictive power. What has predictive power? I can't tell you. There. All of these things. And need for stimulation, proneness to boredom, impulsivity, irresponsibility, behavioral problems, exactly what Adam Smith would have told us. The source of evil in this way is far more attributable to lack of self-control than it is to lack of empathy. Then there's the heart. People often quote David Hume here, arguing that pure reason isn't enough. Reason is, said Hume, and not only to be the slave of the passions. I agree with this. I think you need something to motivate you to do good. Cost-benefit analysis isn't sufficient because it will never motivate you to do the right thing. But as we've seen from these cases, the motivation need not be empathy. It could be compassion. People use empathy in different ways. And some people might want to insist that the term should be used for concern, compassion, and so on. And I'm totally comfortable with that. I have no interest in making a terminological argument. My argument is just this. Whatever you want to call it, putting yourself in other people's shoes is a moral mistake. It makes us worse people, not better people. And we should stop it. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
We do.
Oh, yes.
Hi.
Hey.
So, I'm a neuroscience student, so maybe everything I'm about to say goes against that. And sorry, Professor Drama, wherever you are. But I guess my ultimate question to you is, as somebody who's maybe labeled as different or abnormal all the time, and it's hard to be labeled as something like that. It's just, even for doing something really good, people will try to take that away from you. And what do you have? I think I look at empathy, or I like the word sentimental compassion better, because it gives people a voice. It gives people courage and it gives people hope. And that's how I have to look at it, because otherwise, what would you be without that? There are people. I think empathy, a lack of empathy, in a lot of ways, gives people the right to label you and the right to judge you before they even know who you are. And especially in regards to mental illness, I think that's one of the hardest things in this country that we're dealing with. And how can you look at someone who knows depressed, literally has the symptoms of depression, has symptoms of PTSD, has symptoms of all multitudes of things, and how can you look at someone and just go by the label and not try? Even that mere attempt of trying to understand it goes a long way. It could save a life. What are your thoughts on that?
So you're saying a couple of different things. And so one aspect of what you're saying is we should certainly try to understand other people, which I totally agree. But I want to zoom in on your first point. And maybe this isn't the direction you're taking it, but it strikes me as a really interesting way to think about what you're saying, which is we don't like people who don't have empathy. You're right. Somebody without empathy is considered a weirdo, is considered strange. Nobody wants to give the Nobel Peace Prize to Peter Singer. What you want is a person of feeling, right? This is a way in which some people are stigmatized. And I'm thinking particularly of people with autistic spectrum disorder or Asperger's syndrome, who tend to lack empathy of this sort, and people think there's something morally wrong with them. I think you're exactly right to make that observation. I just think people are mistaken. You take my talk as saying people's common sense notion of what it takes to be a good person is wrong. It turns out, for instance, that people with Asperger's syndrome are, in both their actions and their judgments, every bit as moral as anybody else. Their empathy deficit does not degrade their morality. It turns out that people who are of great feeling and super high empathy actually, in various tests, are less likely to help because they find it overwhelming. So I think you're raising a perfectly good thing about people's conception of what's good. I want to try to shift that conception. I'll tell you a story. This is like the captures. I was on the radio once talking about this to a pastor, and we were having a great discussion. And I mentioned the child beggar example. I say, so even though you feel empathy for kids, you shouldn't give to them because it makes the world worse. And then she said, well, I got to disagree with you. I like the intimacy I get when I help people, when I help the homeless. It makes me feel better, a better person. And I'm horrible at thinking about on my feet. So I said, oh, okay. But then, like a day later, it occurred to me what was the issue here, which is it depends what you want. If you want to feel like a good person and have the people around you see you as a good person, empathy is the way to go. Deep, profound expressions of feeling, a person of heart. If you want to actually help people, you should go in a different way.
Why can't you do both?
When it comes to, you either give to the child beggar or you give to Oxfam. You could give to both, but if you give to child beggar, if it makes the war worse, you made yourself happy and helped ruin a life. And the world is tough. The world is not designed such that our positive feelings and our feel-good feelings are rewarded with positive results. It's tough in part because the world is complicated, and in part because there's unscrupulous people who exploit our positive feelings for evil ends. But I think in some way there's a choice to be made. There are hard moral problems, and I think empathy has gotten an easy pass on them. Yes?
Thank you. This is a really thought-provoking presentation. I don't have a very well-formed question. It's kind of a isn't it funny type of question.
Okay.
Isn't it funny how when we do have one of these mass killings,
Mm-hmm.
right, in the public media, there's a lot of attention given to survivors, families of survivors,
Yep.
victims, their life stories. And then when the conversations take a public policy turn, there's a lot turn.
Yep.
Public policy, there's a backlash about politicizing
Mm-hmm.
of the event, as if the empathic kind of indulgences maybe are kind of more moral than taking any
Yeah.
kind of public policy analysis on it.
So I like that case. I'll give an answer which you may not like. I'll let you respond if you want to. I actually think the backlash about politicizing these events is the right one. And I'll give a contemporary example. Donald Trump talks all the time about a woman named Kate. If you watch Donald Trump, he'll just call her Kate, because by now her audience knows who she is. She's a woman in San Francisco who was murdered, a random murder by an undocumented immigrant. Donald Trump wants Kate to matter when it comes to shaping our laws. It comes to shaping our laws, our immigration policy, and so on. And now, I have nothing interesting to say about what our immigration policy should be, but I know this. One salient individual should not divert policy. One salient event should. If you want to make a case for gun control, show me the statistics. Let's look at the statistics. If you want to make a case that undocumented immigrants are killing people, let's see some numbers. Now, this is, of course, what people want to say, oh my God, Kate was killed by a Mexican. Let's move, let's act. And I think there's some sort of lawyer claim that says that, hard cases make bad laws. And I think that these emotionally salient cases matter way too much to us. And so I think we should guard against taking them too seriously. Does that make any sense?
It does make sense. I take your first point that these isolated cases shouldn't, but I don't like that people then don't want to talk about numbers.
Oh yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. I mean, and in fact, this is in fact why, unfortunately, why you can't have both. So again, I'm a mild Donald Trump obsessive these days, as we all are on both sides. And I've seen Trump challenged by saying, look, these places that you say are loaded with illegal immigrants are statistically safer than other places which don't have illegal immigrants. And Trump says, don't give me these numbers. Have I told you about Kate? And you're, so I would like to change what every president does in the State of the Union is they bring up a string of victims up there. Killed, if you're a Democrat, killed by gun violence. If you're a Republican, killed by too much government regulation. You know, there's the families up there. Look, and now the person stands up and then there's applause. I want to make appeals to empathic instances. I would think that we should find that as repugnant as open arguments based on racism. People should say, I know what you're doing. You're trying to make me turn away from the numbers, from what really matters, and appeal to my gross sentiments, and I won't let you do it. So I agree. We should be obsessed with the data. Not because data is important, but because data summarizes the fate of people. And it's the best way of thinking about what matters. Yeah.
So it should and would like to see. What do we know about what's actually possible? I mean, is there a group of people who are simply going to be motivated by empathy, by cases, who we will never get to look at the numbers and say, I should care about issue, people, diseases they pick, and that's the only way we pour ice buckets over people.
Yep.
We pick at whatever.
It's a great question. I mean, it could be told at many different levels. So there are arguments that at certain policy levels, you could set up structures that give you wise, non-empathic solutions as part of a general policy that people have to follow that doesn't rely on individuals. Here's a good example. Suppose you want to have a job hiring process that's not affected by racist or sexist bias. So what you can do is say, well, let's find a pool of judges who are not racist or sexist. Well, how do you do that? Maybe we all are, maybe we're all vulnerable. But instead what you could say is, well, let's have a policy which is a blind reviewing procedure, where we don't know the gender or race of the person. Or let's have a quota system, or whatever your idea is. So you can set policies in place in general. The charity case is interesting. So and I don't know the answer, but there is a movement of effective altruism. There are at least some people, for instance, who go to the website called GiveWell. And there's other websites, who Yale actually has one too, and MIT as well, that ranks charities on their effectiveness. And they say, I'm not going to give to the charity that's going to show me the cutest baby. I'm not going to give to the charity that shows me people who look like me, who have, who give me some horrible villain in Africa to fight against, or some figure like Bono to cheer for. I'm going to look at what cold-blooded analysts say will give me the most altruism for my buck. Now, Larissa McFarquhar has a critique of this where she calls it sort of the drone policy of altruism. Altruism, statistical, an abstract thing. And some people will work that way. Will everybody? Will some people be refused to? Probably. And so it's an empirical question. In 10 years, we'll see how much people's giving has been shaped by these assessments of the quality of the giving. Maybe the effective altruism movement will just kind of fizzle out and we'll be back to where we started from. I'm more optimistic, but I honestly don't know. So you're making two good points, and the first one is whether I'm being fair to Smith. And I have another friend of mine, Michael Frazier, who said, no matter how much I make my views more and more so, he said, yeah, it's not quite Smith. Smith is much, and you may well be right that in the end I can't enlist Smith as on my side as a foe of empathy. Certainly, you're right that Smith's developmental theory puts empathy at the core of morality, as does Hume's. And I think they're both mistaken. If I had another half hour, I could talk about developmental data suggesting that empathy is not the developmental core of morality. But you're right that Smith's views are not totally aligned with mine, and he's a smart guy, so maybe I should worry about that. But now put aside Smith, I actually think it's just, and here is maybe disagreement that you and I might have, which we can talk about later, is that you don't need empathy for a lot of what I'm talking about. So take the Batson case. When you say it's not fair to move this girl up, at no point psychologically do you need to imagine a child and feel his or her pain. When you do a utilitarian analysis of whether the world's better off if you continue the vaccine program or cut it off, at no point do you need to do empathy. We could literally go into your brain, take out the parts that do empathy, and your moral capacity would be intact. This is not a developmental claim. I have not defended a developmental claim. But I think, in the end, even appealing to an impartial spectator or John Rawls's original position does involve kind of bringing up a person that you look at. But it does involve empathy in an interesting sense. Yes. So there's two separate questions. One question which I argued is, right now, for me to be impartial, requires no empathy. For me to be utilitarian requires no empathy. Deontology requires no empathy. There's another argument, which is my capacity to take impartiality seriously must have emerged at some point from an empathic capacity in development or in human history. That I don't believe, but I haven't made the argument either way. But my claim about the irrelevance of empathy is a descriptive one, a psychologically descriptive one. And you're right that it may be that a normative justification for certain ways of life or decisions may ultimately rest on empathy, but that's a separate question. I didn't have a single epiphany moment, but basically, I'll tell you, it's kind of you to ask. I've written a lot, actually, in this book, available, considerably reduced rates on Amazon, and elsewhere, against disgust. So some people argue, like Leon Katz and other people, that disgust is a powerful moral guide. The disgust you feel towards something is something that has some wisdom to it, telling you it's wrong. And over the course of, I've always argued that that's mistaken. I've argued that disgust is a horrible moral guide and give evolutionary arguments and all sorts of arguments. But it occurred to me that one could go through each sort of emotion and talk about it and give it the same level of scrutiny. So anger is an interesting case. I'm actually more against empathy than I am against anger. I think there are cases that say anger might be a necessary emotion for certain forms of positive moral change. So you can look through each one kind of clinically and ask gratitude, pride, envy, and so on. And so I started to look at empathy. Honestly, the reason why I focused on empathy is because I'm very much of a rationalist. I think these feelings are for the birds. And if I try to make this case by giving you disgust, every liberal says, oh yeah, disgust is horrible. That's what makes us hate interracial marriage and gay marriage and that. But then you say empathy. Well, empathy is great. So if I could convince people to be critical of empathy, all the rest of the emotions will fall along with it. I've revealed my plan. Yes?
You're saying not only do we not need empathy, but we don't need feelings at all?
No, I think we need, that would be putting it too strong. I think Hume is in the end right. I think, first thing, there's all reasons why we might want feelings that have nothing to do with morality. I think it's part of a rich life to have love and empathy and hate and anger. This is part of a rich life for all sorts of other ways. Also, I think for morality, you're not going to be a moral person unless you care for people, unless people's life has value. If you were an entirely emotionless creature, as Hume would say, there'd be no reason to care more about the death of 1,000 people than stubbing your toe. What's the difference? If people, but so you need some caring. I'm very impressed by the Buddhist work and then the neuroscience work distinguishing compassion from empathy. And I think that as empathy, you make a case against empathy, and I think compassion moves in to fill the gap. Yes?
You might have just answered a little bit of my question, but you didn't have a chance to talk about some of the infant work.
No.
Which seems to suggest that babies have what looks like an empathic response. And I guess my question would be, it seems to suggest that we are wired in to have empathy. What's the purpose of building human beings with empathy then?
babies are, this is kind of ran out of time, so your question, they're kind to each other. There's evidence for sharing, for compassion, there's experimental work of the sort I think you're alluding to, where like a mother pretends to be hurt and then a child will console her and so on. There's a work by Varnikin and Tomasello showing spontaneous helping in toddlers. And so but what I'd like to argue is that when you look at these things closely, there's actually very little evidence for empathy as opposed to for compassion and caring. And so you look back at the studies by, yeah, I love that video. You look back at the studies of Hay et al. Or Carolyn von Wexler et al. And some of these studies look at the stress that children show at the suffering of others. And it turns out that it's only for the much older children you get reliable correlations between the stress of the suffering of another and the ability to help. Nancy Eisenberg does the same stuff. Early on, you seem to have compassion without empathy. This is also true for non-humans. So Franz de Waal points out that animals will help one another if they lost a fight. They'll groom the loser of a confrontation. But what's interesting, Paul Harris points this out, is look at the face of the creature helping. It's not in distress or anguish, it's care. Now, that raises the question, what's empathy for? Because, you know, I'm an evolutionary psychologist, I'm a Darwinian. What's it for? I can see of two possible answers, and maybe you have a third, or maybe you favor one of them. One is that empathy is actually that effective empathy in the Smith sense, is a way of understanding other people, is a shortcut for understanding other people. I see you bang your hand, my hand hurts, I say, oh, that must hurt for you. And it's a very quick and dirty way of getting access into other people's heads. A second claim, and this is a claim that Batson has made, is that empathy exists for a developmental purpose, but not for kids, but for parents, in particular for mothers. So that empathy has evolved as a mechanism to get us into sync with our infants. And the argument for this, one argument for this is that hormones like oxytocin, which are related to things like childbirth and lactation, also are related in some interesting sense to empathy. So empathy might not be a thing for babies, it might be a thing for parents. Now, if that were true, it would make a worrying thing for my argument, which is, what would happen if you took away all empathy from a mother having a baby? She has compassion, she loves the baby and all that, but she doesn't have empathic connection. My claim, based on my arguments, would be everything would be A-okay, but I could be wrong.
I guess we could look at some of those children. You're suggesting they're not empathic,
Yep.
but maybe we could look at how their brains light up and see if those empathy regions are active.
Certainly, by the time you could scan them, like 6 and 7-year-olds, you do get the same results as adults. You do get the same mirroring capacity. It's just like the Hay et al. Study. It looked for distress. They look at these kids, and they don't find. So kids watch another kid bang his head. Kid starts crying. The other kid looks and doesn't start crying. It's kind of cool. And you'd expect kids. Now you say, well, a kid's hiding it and being stoic, but that's not what a 10-month-old does. So we don't have the neural data, certainly, but behaviorally, they don't look like they're mirroring the pain, which is really cool. And you know, there's all this, it used to be the lore in infancy, including stuff that I wrote in my books, was babies are hugely empathic. They're imitating everything, they're copying everything. Andrew Meltzoff done some wonderful work and so on. But recently, there's been a backlash. People like Celia Hayes have done these careful reviews, and it's very hard to find empathy in kids under 6 months. Most studies don't find it. Same with imitation, you need to work hard. Does that make sense? Does that fit your knowledge literature? Okay, thank you. The first question is, would it be possible to lose your empathic responses because you feel older? And I don't think it is. But the second question is it possible to override them? And there I would give the same analogy I gave before, which is when I see somebody who is attractive, I feel a lot more fond towards them than somebody who's ugly. When I see somebody who's my race, my country, my language, I feel a lot more pull to them than for a stranger. Certainly when I see my kid, I feel this huge rush of love. And if I see somebody else, not so much. Those are, and I think for any of these, we're not going to get rid of that. That's our biology. That's fundamental. But we could say, yeah, I know I tend to like people who look like me more, but it's wrong to be racist, and I'm going to try not to be. I know the attractive person applies for the job, and the ugly person applies for the job, and I know I feel much better towards the attractive person. Attractiveness biases are so powerful, they're way above race biases in a lot of studies. But I know that's wrong, if it's for a research assistant and not a model. You know, how they look should be totally irrelevant. So I could fight it. And I think we're kind of good in fighting in other ways. I think we're good at, so when I'm, and we're good because we can do it on a personal level, but we can also do it at a structural level. I had to hire a research assistant this summer. It so happened my son was free. But I wasn't allowed to hire him because Yale has rules that you can't hire your kid. Although at the time I would have wanted to hire my kid, I appreciate that's kind of a smart rule. You know, I might really want to hire, you know, graduate students who look like me, and who don't speak with an accent, and who are attractive. All the biases. I know that's wrong though, so I try not to, and I even try to instill procedures that stop me from doing so. So to answer your question, which is a good one, is I don't think these gut feelings are going to go away. Same for disgust. Some things I see might disgust me. Some sexual orientations that are very different from my own might feel, oh my God, that's gross. But I think I could say, well, that's how I feel. But unless I have a good argument why it should be immoral or illegal, it's none of my business. So I'm not saying get rid of the feelings. I'm saying we can transform what we do with them. The effective altruists, for instance, aren't people who don't care about other people, who aren't struck by a small child and so on. They're people who've chosen not to let it matter. Empathy, one of the things which I hadn't thought of, but it's a nice answer, empathy can help you learn from other people, which is, I see you put your hand in the fire and scream. I say, well, that's interesting. But if I have empathy, I feel your pain. And now I say, I'm not going to put my hand in the fire. And that's actually a fairly interesting theory.
It's actually taken from the notion of theory of mind and the mirror neuron development.
Yes.
Motor movement.
Yes, yes, it's a very mirror neuron-y story. Yes, thank you. Yes?
I'm sympathetic to the part of your argument that wants to look beyond empathy in terms of the source of morality. And I'm also attracted to the idea of compassion. But I would add one thing.
Okay.
And that is, compassion is something that's not, in a sense, in us ahead of time. It's evoked by the other, right? And so, you know, what you find with, you know, the hand coming up, the drowning boy, hand coming up, is that there's something quite spontaneous that's going on, right? There's not a calculation going on. You're right to say there's not empathy. The last thing you want to do is empathize with a drowning person.
Yep.
But somehow that other in distress is calling forth your care. And in many situations that happens very spontaneously.
Yep.
How do we understand the emergence of care?
So that's a really good point. I mean, from a developmental point of view, I think what you're talking about is actually, and again, there's a bit of terminology problems, because when people say kids start off as empathic, it wouldn't be right for me to say, oh, you're so wrong, I have so much data against you. What they often mean by empathic is what you're talking about, which is they start off valuing other people. I think that that's part of our basic equipment. I think that's innate. I think obviously it's molded and shaped and expanded by culture and parenting, but I think some valuing of the other is wired within us.
How do you understand that evolution? I agree. How do you understand that evolution?
So I would view that as the sort of standard Darwinian story of morals more generally, involving kin selection, which is, there's a huge advantage to being good to people who share your genes, animals share your genes, and reciprocal altruism and so on, which of course makes a prediction, which is the prediction is what you're talking about should be highly selective. It should happen with people who are familiar, who are clearly kin, and should not happen with strangers. And what I argue in this book, which is now in paperback at considerable discount, is that that's in fact, that's oh my God. Oh, that's such a bad move. But what I argue is that's in fact true. So what you're talking about, that compassion concern exists from the very start. But as one would say from a Darwinian perspective, it's limited in scope. So I'd make a claim, which I'll put forward. You may take this as controversial, which is, in our distant past, or when we're in hunter-gatherer groups, if you saw a perfect stranger drown, you wouldn't care at all. Their value would be nothing.
Yeah, I find that hard to imagine. It
It's
could be a lack of my imagination, but I'm not sure why that would be.
so.
I don't think it would be.
So it's, I mean, there's a long argument to be made, but one part of the argument would go, you look at reports by people like Jared Diamond and actually Margaret Mead before then of current hunter-gatherer groups. And what they both say in different ways is, if you're a hunter-gatherer tribe and you walk across and you see a strange person, what your best move to do, what you would naturally do, is bash their head in. Now, that's not entirely, now in some way you might assume that they're your enemy, you might worry about threat. I actually don't know what it would be. I'm making a prediction even if it was a child drowning, and I'm not sure if that's true. I know it's true for chimps. When warring tribes, when chimp encounters a strange chimp, there's blood on the moon. But to me, it's actually one of the really interesting issues that is yet unresolved. You may in the end turn out to be right. There may be some natural affinity to people that would even extend to strangers. I don't think there is.
It could also be the case that tribalism may well overwhelm
Yes.
one's own spontaneous moral reason.
Yes. So it might be that the hunter-gatherers, absent their tribal values that they've done, would be fine with strangers.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you.
For good questions.